All right. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you back here for our weekly virtual author event series, which we've been doing since April and has been really great. We've done dozens and dozens of events. I want to say 75 plus maybe. And, it's been a really cool way to keep a tether with you, our audience, and our readers and our customers and everyone else, and stay connected in some way in this weird moment in time that we're living in, and also reach a lot of new people. We have people watching from other states, other cities. Maybe they've never been to Tulsa. They don't know about Magic City Books or anything about us. So if you're watching and you don't know anything about us, welcome. So glad to have you be part of this. Magic City Books is owned and operated by the nonprofit Tulsa Literary Coalition. So we're a little bit different than most bookstores. When you buy a book from Magic City, you're putting your money basically back into our programming and our nonprofit side. So kind of shopping is supporting in a way. So thank you for supporting us and keeping us going. A lot of bookstores, I think it's been in the news a lot that since the beginning of the pandemic, one independent bookstore a week in the country has closed. And while certainly it's been tough for us, we've been amazed at the turnout for response and people keeping us really more than afloat. In many ways we've been thriving. So thank you for that kind of support. It's been really important to us. I'll say just quickly, I hope you have either voted already or have plans to go vote tomorrow. It's a big day. It's nice to have a little bit of a break here from the news so we can talk about still something very American, but a little bit different, and give you a break before the big to do tomorrow. We'll see what happens. So stay out there, stay safe, go vote, and we'll see you on the other side of that. I am always thrilled when we get a chance to kind of dive into American history. And also when I get a chance to dive into something that I had no real knowledge base about. Tecumseh, for example, is someone who I think we've probably heard the name. We maybe have some passing interest or information in our head about, but I certainly didn't know anything about him or his brother or really the Shawnee Nation or anything about that. And especially the War of 1812, probably the war that we know the least about. We've heard about it. We know Tippecanoe and Tyler too. We know some of these kind of I guess in some ways cliches that we've had over the years, but we just never have had a chance to dive in. And this was a really great opportunity to just dive into this real interesting world. And Peter Cozzens has been writing about American history for a long time, has written, gosh, Peter, are you getting close to 20 books? How many books are we talking here?
I'm 4 short of 20.
Yeah. Yeah, so Peter's been writing about especially the American West and Native Americans, and really certainly has an interest in a certain type of American history. But this has just been such a fun read. So we're going to talk about Tecumseh and the Prophet. We're going to take your questions. So if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and I'll be feeding those to Peter as we go. And of course, buy this book. Believe it or not, we're like 6 weeks away, 7, 8 weeks away from Christmas. We've got holiday season. This is a really great gift for someone who wants to just kind of escape into a part of the American story that is little known for most of us. So we're going to put links in the chat here. You can buy the book and support us and give Peter a little boost as well there. So thank you, Peter. Welcome.
And thank you for having me, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
So I'd like to there's 3 things, if we could kind of start to kind of lay the groundwork for people. Sure. I'd like you to kind of just give us the Cliff Notes on a little bit. One would be, who was Tecumseh? That would be number 1. The second would be, so that's kind of the who, and you can go into the prophet as well, but maybe kind of set up the who. And then I'd like to talk about the where, kind of talk about the Old Northwest, or what you describe as the Old Northwest, which is something that I'm really not familiar with, and you kind of have to rejigger the way you think about the map in your head. So that's the the who, the where, and then the when. Kind of talking about that period and setting the tone of what was happening in America at that time. So kind of begin. Sure. Who was Tecumseh and who was the prophet?
Okay, if you don't mind, I'll jigger the sequence a bit.
Please do it in any way you'd like.
And I'll start with the where and when. My previous book, The Earth is Weeping, which some of you may have read, dealt with the Indian Wars in the American West, post-Civil War, the Indian Wars of popular imagination. when I finished that book, I realized that, a heck of a lot happened east of the Mississippi River before the Indian Wars of the West, and that those conflicts are little known, but critical. And without the American conquest of the Old Northwest, as Jeff said, which is today's present day Midwest and Upper Great Lakes, there would not have been the westward migration that brought about the Indian Wars of the West. So what I decided to do, in fact, I've constructed a trilogy, and it's kind of backwards chronologically. I'm going back with Tecumseh the Prophet to look at the conquest, the climax of the struggle for the Old Northwest. And then a book I'm working on now, my next book, Red Sticks and Old Hickory, I will look at what happened south of the Ohio River in what's called the Old Southwest. That is today's modern Deep South. So ultimately, we'll have covered three areas: the Indian Wars of the West, post-American Civil War, the wars of the Old Northwest, in which Tecumseh and his brother were the preeminent players, and then the conflicts in the Deep South. And the time frame really we're looking at is once to get past the historical background, the action really goes from 1768, when Tecumseh was born, a member of the Shawnee people in modern day Southern Ohio, to his death in 1813 in the War of 1812, fighting with the British in some very decisive battles. And then on with his brother's subsequent 2 decades of life and his ultimate death in modern day, which is modern day Kansas City, Kansas. So we'll look at the Old Northwest, the modern Midwest, from about 1768 until 1713, and then a couple of decades after, until Tenskwatawa's death.
Yeah.
And Tecumseh was a member of the Shawnee, who were one of at least 14 tribes in the present day Midwest. They were by no means the largest tribe. Again, all these tribes were scattered throughout the Midwest. And he was the elder brother. Tenskwatawa, the so-called prophet, was his younger brother. And they came to maturity at a time of great tumult in their world. They were children during the Revolutionary War. They had their home villages burned on 3 separate occasions and were forced to move deeper into Ohio as children and adolescents. So they came to age during a time of almost constant upheaval and fighting.
I wonder, you've written so much history. You kind of actually made some points there that I was going to touch on, which was how your kind of work is connected and you're kind of painting a much broader picture. But when you began writing, these books all those years ago, were you kind of planning to cover a huge swath? Have you always had kind of an idea of where you wanted to go and the stories you want to tell, and that you're kind of building this quilt of American history that you want to cover?
To a degree. My first 3 books were campaign studies of 3 major Civil War campaigns in the Western theater of the war. And I envisioned that as a trilogy. And my subsequent Civil War books, just as things seemed interesting to me or to have been neglected, I chose topics accordingly. But when I wrote The Earth is Weeping, I really honestly envisioned just a standalone history of the Indian Wars in the West to, I hesitate to use the word replace, but to introduce a new generation of readers to the Indian Wars, given that D. Brown's iconic Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was 40 years old when I wrote my book. And I really didn't envision going beyond the Indian Wars in the American West until after I wrote that. And when I started my work on Tecumseh the Prophet, I didn't, like you, Jeff, I'll be honest, I didn't know much more about Tecumseh than that he was an iconic Indian leader, that many historians have called him the greatest of all Indian leaders, and that William Tecumseh Sherman boyhood name was Tecumseh Sherman. And that's about the extent of my knowledge, honestly, when I started.
That's probably the first place I ever heard that name, honestly, was in association with William Tecumseh Sherman. I don't think,
Me too.
because, growing up in Oklahoma here, we of course had some curriculum based on Native history, certainly not enough and certainly not as deep as it should be, but I don't recall having too much or any information about Tecumseh really on part of the curriculum. I do think that those kind of things change. I do wonder, I don't know how old you are, but I would assume you're kind of in the boomer generation.
Lower boomer, yeah.
Lower boomer. And I do wonder, there's an I'm getting at the point of your interest and how you kind of decide what you want to spend your life working on. There is that kind of 50s, 60s, early television, Western cowboys and Indians element that kind of was very prevalent at that time. It was very at the center of popular culture. Do you know where the seeds were planted, where you wanted to kind of be really, you grew up in Illinois, I believe.
Right.
Where did this interest in the West and kind of that element come from?
I honestly, I can pinpoint where my interest in the Civil War came from, because I initially wrote on the American Civil War, and that interest developed when I was a boy. From reading things like the Golden Book of the Civil War, playing with the little toy soldiers and recreating battles. I mean, that had been with me since childhood. And I didn't pursue a career in history. I was an Army officer, then a Foreign Service officer with the State Department for 30 years. But the interest was always there. And I wrote a number of my books while I was in the Foreign Service. But when it came to my book on the Indian Wars, I honestly was I wanted to write something broad. I wanted to write about an epic or an era in American history that was crucial, but neglected. And I wanted to make something that maintained an element of conflict and strife. I just can't seem to get away from that in my books. I mean, that's essential to my writing. Again, I recognize that D. Brown's book was dated, as fine a book as it was dated. It was based on limited sources of material, and no New York publisher had done a book on the subject in over 4 decades when I proposed this. And I guess I wasn't alone in thinking this was the right era to write on, because about a dozen publishers bid on the book. So that's how it started. Really, I was looking for an era neglected, had an element of conflict, and which was critical to our history. And then I zoomed in on the West.
It's interesting. You mentioned, of course, you've written so much on the Civil War. And then this, The Earth is Weeping feels like a pivot point in a way where it's kind of sending you on a different path.
Right.
At that point, had you exhausted what you wanted to say about the Civil War?
Exactly. I mean, my last book in the Civil War was on the Stonewall Jackson Shenandoah Valley campaign. And I thought it was a very good book, but I felt like it was becoming formulaic, and that I needed more of a challenge. I needed to kind of recharge my batteries and go in a new direction. And I wanted to write about something, again, about which I didn't know a great deal. And both The Earth is Weeping and now Tecumseh the Prophet fit the bill in that respect.
Yeah. You mentioned you were a Foreign Service officer. I think we hear that term a lot, probably don't really know what it actually means. You were in the Foreign Service for 30 years, you said. What did you do there, and what is a foreign? We know what the State Department is. Right. We know what diplomats are. I think in a very abstract sense, like we hear that term. I think most of us think of ambassadors. We don't really know the on the ground day-to-day work. Talk about your work there. I'm just curious.
Again, the Foreign Service is the career diplomatic service of the United States. Foreign Service officers are the only civilian employees of the U.S. government who hold presidential commissions and hold rank in person as opposed to grade in their job. So you progress through ranks in the Foreign Service that have their equivalent in the military. For instance, I retired as equivalent of a brigadier general in the military. I served at embassies or United States consulates general in Latin America my whole career when I was not posted in DC. Generally, you pick a regional area, develop a regional expertise, and maybe take a tour or two elsewhere, but spend from 3 to 4 years in any given country. And I was in Costa Rica for my first tour during the early days of the Contras. I was the Honduras desk officer during the height of the Contra wars. I actually spent some time down in the Contra base camps in Honduras. I was in Peru during the height of the Shining Path terrorist movement. I was in Consul General in Panama when we handed the canal over to the Panamanians in 2000. My last tour was as Consul General in Monterrey, Mexico, where I supervised a large mission that was not only State Department personnel, but also, drug enforcement agency, FBI, immigration, you name it, like a mini embassy. So our foreign service work overseas is really, our job is to be the executive branch's direct liaison with the host country government to report on activities in that government and to maintain our day-to-day relations with a particular country.
Every one of those places and moments you mentioned, there's probably a million stories with each of those because they were such pivotal moments. But how come, I'm curious, why have you not written about any of those? You write about other people. Have you ever considered writing a memoir about your time in the Foreign Service? Or
a couple reasons. The State Department, if you write on anything related to your time in the Foreign Service, even if it's fiction, I think I could probably write some great short stories about the Shining Path terrorists, because I was almost killed myself in a terrorist attack. I was caught in the middle of a major terrorist attack. But if you write about anything related to your Foreign Service experience, you have to have it vetted by the State Department. And I've had colleagues who've done this, and the writing after a while no longer becomes their own.
Right.
Whereas if I'm writing on the American West, Native Americans, there's no need for me to have any involvement with the State Department. And there's always the danger too of when you're writing, if you write about your career work, be it in the Foreign Service or the CIA or whatever, of inadvertently putting something classified down on paper. Yeah. Again,
there's no redactions in Tecumseh and the Prophet. So
no. And the mental escape, while I was in the Foreign Service, the mental escape from my day-to-day work to the 1860s was a nice break.
That's a good point. Speaking of vetting and kind of the work that you do, of course, obviously there's a million steps in the research for a thing. We have a question that says, love this topic. Did you speak to any citizens from the 3 Shawnee tribes, all of which have their modern reservations in Oklahoma, about their perspectives on what you were writing about? Did you kind of have any connections to the Shawnee?
Not really. I honestly, and this is not to say anything, say that I was intentionally trying to short any particular research source. I read writings of Tecumseh's grandson, but I found, particularly in The Earth is Weeping, that Native American oral tradition is really not necessarily inherently more reliable than anyone else's oral tradition, and that, and I discovered this in particular with the Apaches, that a lot of the old wounds from the era of conflict with the United States still exist, because every tribe, including the Shawnee, were divided during these periods of conflict, and those divisions tend to perpetuate in the memories of people of those tribes, and a lot of mythology creeps into the oral tradition. So I really intentionally based my research on contemporaneous material to the extent that I could. And granted, there's the problem, the question actually arises, well, what do you do in the case of Native Americans who weren't literate in written English? And that was not the problem that I feared it would be. for a number of reasons. I did discover beyond a doubt that Tecumseh spoke English. His brother did not, but Tecumseh spoke conversational English because he was raised with white captive boys and from them learned English and taught them Shawnee. And many of these young men who knew Tecumseh in his youth and afterwards left their written recollections, which are really quite reliable, because without exception, they spoke very fondly of their time living with the Indians. And there's just a voluminous amount of correspondence of British officials in Canada, their interactions with Tecumseh and the Prophet. They also had interactions with everything from Moravian missionaries to, of course, regular interaction with Governor William Henry Harrison of the Indiana Territory, Ohio settlers. So there was enough material there that I could tell the story with contemporaneous sources. And fortunately, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, a decade or so after the War of 1812, he began a tenuous friendship with the governor of the Michigan Territory, who had been one of his opponents in the War of 1812, and related a lot of his experiences, which were then preserved in writing. So the material existed for me to focus solely on contemporaneous sources, or almost solely.
Follow-up question from another one of our viewers that's kind of piggybacking on that one a little bit, which is, now that the book is out, of course, and it's gotten great reviews, have you heard from anyone in the Shawnee Nation about the book? Have you had any feedback from any readers who are, I don't know if there's any bloodline from any of these folks that still exist in any real way, but have you heard from anyone?
Not yet. Although I did, in the case of The Earth is Weeping, I did hear from gradually over time. I heard from many, including the great granddaughter of Washakie, who is a great Shoshone chief, who was very grateful that I told the story in a balanced way. She she ordered extra copies for all her grandchildren. And what I really strive to do, and in my books, and I believe in my heart that I succeeded as well as possible, is to present. And I devoted well over a chapter in totality to a discussion of the Shawnee way of life and of the woodland tribes in the Midwest in general, because there were more similarities than differences. So I treated everything from the method of child rearing to the clan system, to what kind of day-to-day prosaic life was like among Indians, what they ate, that their diet was. So I really tried to put these men in their milieu for the readers, keep my mind in their milieu, and try to look at things to the extent I could from their perspective. And I think that really helped, in particular, with Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee Prophet, who historically has been shorted because he truly was, without a doubt, the greatest of all Native American prophets. And there was been a long tradition of prophets in Native American history, those who claimed and were believed to be able to communicate with the master of life, the Great Spirit. And I tried to look at events through his perspective, that is to say, through the eyes of a Shawnee, for whom things like witchcraft, which was an important element in his doctrine, and which has turned off a lot of historians, as well as a lot of his non-Indian contemporaries, because of his desire to remove the pernicious influence of witches among the Indians. He was dismissed as a charlatan or a madman. But when you look at things through the eyes of the Shawnee of the period, witchcraft and a belief in that was as much a part of their lives as a belief in Jesus Christ is in the lives of Christians. So I tried to immerse myself in that point of view. And when I was looking at events, look at them through their eyes, based on their upbringing, the cultural and religious traditions in which they were raised.
You know, I was when I was reading the book and kind of thinking about these two characters, these two men, it made me think about a few other pieces of American history that I saw some similarities to Tecumseh and his ability to make deals and alliances, and kind of, he was a politician in many ways.
Right.
He very much reminded me of, like, when you read like about Lyndon Johnson, or some, someone who could have these pretty big machinations, and someone who was kind of a wheeler dealer and could get things done. And so I kind of was thinking about those Robert Caro books a little bit. And then when I was thinking about the Prophet, the narrative that came to mind was the journey of, when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X, he kind of starts off as this kind of ne'er-do-well, kind of misfit character, lost in crime and drugs and all these different things, ends up kind of redeeming himself and becoming this, spiritual leader, this figure who, and the Prophet had kind of a similar journey, kind of rising out of what could have been a very dark path, and ending up there. That's just an aside, but do you see modern parallels, and when you think about these people?
That's a fantastic analogy that you just gave. I mean, Tenskwatawa, the Prophet, who created the Pan-Indian Alliance, which Tecumseh then turned from a social and religious kind of revivalist, nativist revival movement into a political military alliance to resist American, white encroachment on Indian lands in the Midwest. But it started with Tenskwatawa in 1805 to kind of paint a picture. He was an absolute dissolute. One of the great problems, beside the loss of land in shady land deals that had befallen the tribes of the Midwest, was the pernicious influence of alcohol. I mean, the Indian villages in the Midwest were literally awash in alcohol, supplied by white, white traders. Entire villages were literally, at the mercy of alcohol. And game was becoming scarce. There were winters when the Indians were actually eating their own horses and their dogs to stay alive. Things were truly, truly on the decline, spiritually, culturally, morally, for the tribes in the Midwest. I mean, they were people bereft. Tenskwatawa was as dissolute as they came. He actually became an alcoholic fairly early in life. He tried his hand at shamanism as a medicine man, failed at that. He depended upon his brother Tecumseh, who was kind of the beau ideal of a Shawnee man. He was an excellent hunter, excellent warrior. He depended on Tecumseh and his sister's husband, his brother-in-law, for sustenance, to keep his family going. And then one day he was sitting before his fire, kind of contemplating the fate of the Indians, and he fell into a near-death trance in which he ascended to the afterlife and spoke with the master of life, or so he claimed, who told Tenskwatawa where the Indians were going wrong, what they needed to do to regain their golden era and their way of life. And I mean, he was so near death, so catatonic, that Tecumseh and his friends literally were preparing him for burial, when after a day and a half he came to and started speaking of his doctrine, the first point of which was that the Indians must abjure alcohol. And he went from, I mean, he would be an incredible poster child for AA. He went from being an alcoholic one day to a complete teetotaler, a complete change in character. And he attracted Native Americans from tribes throughout the Midwest, all the way from where he lived in Ohio, as far west as the Mississippi River and just beyond, up to the northernmost portions of Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan. And so he created that initial movement. And then as the white threat of a further encroachment grew, and the likelihood of war between the United States and Britain grew, Tecumseh emerged and added to this religious social doctrine, the unifying purpose of we must all recognize that we are one people and stop negotiating these treaties individually and being taken advantage of, played against one another by the white man. Unite and form a pan-Indian alliance and recognize that this land is ours in common and no one tribe or individual chief has a right to sell it. And that was kind of a transformative moment. But throughout the life of the alliance, the brothers maintained, they had a symbiotic relationship. Tecumseh was, without a doubt, the principal war leader, but the prophet also led warriors in action in the War of 1812, and he also had a political role in the movement. So it was very much symbiotic. I in my book, I maintain that because their alliance was the most potent Indian alliance that the United States ever faced on its march westward, that they, without a doubt, are the two most important siblings in Native American history. And giving Indians their due, I would argue that they are two of the most important brothers in American history, period. I mean, if we look at it comparing to the West, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, they fought Custer at the Little Bighorn. It was the apex of Indian resistance in the West. Tecumseh, in his alliance, he mustered at the apex of his alliance in the War of 1812, he mustered nearly 3 times as many warriors as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse did. So it was of primary importance.
It's interesting. You think about the alliance, right? And how, I don't know, what a unique idea it was at that time. I mean, we're talking 100 plus years before the League of Nations idea was thrown around, before all these things, the idea of kind of bringing all these disparate elements together to kind of do something like that was so revolutionary at the time. I wonder, when going back to what you were talking about, the prophet, right? You're talking about that catatonic state. Whenever you're writing about something that's kind of about a person, say, leaving a certain plane of existence or doing something like that, you obviously don't have hard data on that. And also, how do you separate myth building? Because someone like him, of course, was a mythological character to his people. How do you kind of know what was told? And it's very difficult to parse.
Right. It surprisingly, it wasn't that difficult for me, and I mean this sincerely, that for me the most moving passage of many in the book is Tenskwatawa's trance, and I could almost feel myself being lifted up with him, and that's because the sources were so rich. There were Moravian missionaries who lived within 20 some miles of his village, who received reports from members of their congregation and other Indians in the area of this prophet who'd suddenly arisen among the Shawnee. And they were getting the information contemporaneously from their flock. Several of them actually visited Tenskwatawa just a few months afterward to learn from him directly what his creed was. And so they were taking down and recording for their church higher-ups what the creed was, not only hearing it from Tenskwatawa's lips, but also from other of his followers. And then he appointed, for lack of a better word, disciples to carry the word out further in the Midwest. One in particular named Le Magua, who took the message up into upper Wisconsin, and who was interviewed by U.S. Army officers up there. And so there were enough contemporaneous sources, apart from what Tenskwatawa himself said, to really present it in a plausible and a reliable way. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do that until I explored all the source material.
Let's talk about the War of 1812 for a few minutes. I think most people don't have a ton of knowledge about it. One, it certainly was not just in 1812. It began in 1812 and went on for several years. In some ways, do you view it kind of as a sequel to the American Revolution? Do you view it as, it could also be viewed as the first, an early World War, when you think about the alliances and how many countries were involved? I mean, it's interesting to think about in that regard. How do you kind of look at it in the broader scope of American wars as far as impact? And, we certainly didn't win it. It kind of ended in kind of a stalemate in a certain sense. We always heard that Vietnam was the first war that America ever lost, but in some ways, this was a very different situation as well.
Right. I'd like to look at it, actually, I think it might be more instructive to look at it from the point of view of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. The War of 1812, I mean, just briefly, the causes, at least from the American perspective, the primary causes were, Britain was at war with Napoleon. They needed sailors for their navy, so they began impressing sailors off American ships to serve in the British Navy. They blockaded French ports, which caused great economic suffering in the United States. So the primary reasons why the United States, or at least reasons that President Madison gave for agreeing to war, were largely relations to how Great Britain was treating the United States on the ocean and blocking our trade. But another point that Madison made in his address to Congress was British machinations in provoking what they saw. The Americans generally saw Tecumseh as a tool of the British to try to reclaim the Midwest, not for the Indians, but for the British, which was not the case at all. But that was one of the reasons the Americans gave for declaring war on Great Britain. I think more honestly, those who the so-called war hawks in Congress, they instigated for war for two reasons. One, they wanted Canada. They wanted Canada as part of the United States, both to guarantee our northern boundaries and to expand northward. And secondly, there was a sense that, okay, we in 1810, 11, 12, we're now, a couple of generations removed from the War of Independence. We want to do something that shows we're worthy of maintaining, of inheriting this republic from our fathers and grandfathers. So to many, it was sort of a second War of Independence. Now for Tecumseh and the Prophet, it was their best chance in fighting in conjunction with the British to actually maintain a homeland of their own in the Midwest against further American encroachment. By the time the War of 1812 broke out, the Indians had pretty much lost all but the northern strip of Ohio, the northern half of Indiana, but the Indians still held virtually all of Michigan, all of Wisconsin, and the better part of Illinois. And Tecumseh, in conjunction with the British, won one of the great British victories of the war, captured the principal American army in what was then the Western Theater in the Old Northwest, the Battle of Detroit. And into 1813, the British and Tecumseh held Michigan against Americans. And the British promised Tecumseh and the Prophet that if they prevailed against the Americans, that they would grant the Indians as much land as was then controlled by the Indians, that is to say, northern Ohio, northern Indiana, and Michigan. They would grant that to the Indians as a buffer state, as an Indian homeland, because it served their interests. I mean, it was repaying the Indians for their service with the British, and it was also providing a buffer between the Americans and British Canada. And that would also, of course, retard American westward movement too, if there was a threat from the north. So it was the last great Indian opportunity to win a homeland in the Midwest. And if they had prevailed, and I was surprised to find that it was not a fait accompli that Tecumseh was going to lose, that it really hung in the balance. If the British had prevailed, and if Tecumseh had, we could very well could have changed the landscape of the United States for a generation or more, or maybe even perpetually, who knows, insofar as Northern Midwest is concerned.
It's funny how these conversations cycle back. Of course, many people know that there's a recent Supreme Court case and decision that is dealing with land here in Oklahoma, which is saying who owns and has the
Right.
sovereignty over certain tribal lands here, and it's very much in question right now. There's conversations happening with our governor and our legislatures about, well, now that this decision has come down, what does that mean for tribal sovereignty? And Tulsa, for example, would be in the middle of a Muskogee Creek land, and are we changing the maps? And so, even though this, like you said, it's 200 years ago plus, some of those issues in many ways are still with us today. Do you see parallels in the work that you do writ large that make you want to write about something that you're dealing with? Do you always try to find something that connects then with now in some way?
Not
or does maybe present itself on sometimes
not explicitly, but it does present itself. Some of you folks may have seen an article in last week's New Yorker magazine. It was an essay. It was an essay based on my book. It was not a straight review, but it was an essay based on my book by a Harvard professor, in which he made, and I agree with him. He used the experience of Tecumseh and what Tecumseh fought for as an example of non-Indians, of Americans' first sins in the Midwest, that was not racial prejudice against Blacks, but rather the way in which the Indians were treated and the way in which their rights were not respected in the Midwest, and into what I thought was some very, very relevant parallels.
Yeah.
And I think part of what inspires me is not necessarily to find direct parallels with what's happening now, but just to show that just how much this conflict was a part of our heritage, conflict with Native peoples. And this wasn't just a phenomenon in the West. The whole Western movement of the United States, beginning with the crossing of the Appalachian Mountains, was one continuous struggle. And to put it in perspective, when the Civil War broke out, some of us, even I had a tendency until I began to work on Tecumseh the Prophet. I think, okay, Ohio, for instance, Indiana, supplied, tens of thousands of troops to the Union cause. Ohio, several 100,000. And I just kind of assumed, well, Ohio had always been there. But wait a minute. Well, just 2 generations before the Civil War, Tecumseh was still fighting the Americans for Northern Ohio. So these events weren't that far removed.
Yeah. We have a question from, it's, we're living in a place where we're not flying around much and we're taking lots of road trips. So this is a good question. It says, what sites would you recommend someone visit that involve the stories told in Tecumseh and the Prophet? Where could we go to learn more and see some of the places you talk about?
Unfortunately, a lot of the places are either suburbs or parts of cities now. For instance, his birthplace is the area where it's believed he was born, outside Chillicothe, Ohio, is now part of Chillicothe. But and Fort Detroit doesn't exist any longer. A couple places I would recommend to folks who are in that part of the country. There's a place called Fort Meigs at the mouth of the Maumee River in northern Ohio, which was the scene of a major battle between the British and Tecumseh against William Henry Harrison and the Americans in 1813, a major battle. And there was a second fight there as well. And Fort Meigs, it was a 2-acre stockade. Really a well-built stockade. And it has been rebuilt and restored to its original appearance. And when I visited Fort Meigs, I was blown away. It surpasses any other fort or stockade, either original remnants or rebuilt, I've seen anywhere in the United States. That's worth a visit. The Tippecanoe battlefield in Prophetstown is worth a visit. There is a restored village in which Shawnee wigwams and council houses have been rebuilt. Those would be the two principal. In Canada, Tecumseh spent a lot of time across the river from Detroit, in Amherstburg, Canada, at Old Fort Malden, which was kind of the center of British activity in that theater. And Old Fort Malden is there. That's worth a visit, and it's also a beautiful part of Lower Ontario. But with the exception of those, unless you really want to get off the beaten path and visit sites of some of the skirmishes that Tecumseh as a young man had with Kentucky militiamen, and I actually was able to find some of these sites that are along the banks of rural creeks in Ohio, and you could actually visit these sites, but they're way off the beaten path. The sites aren't as numerous by any means as they are in the American West, where you can actually visit some of these Indian War battles, and they're either on private ranch land or they've been preserved by the states, by the federal government in almost pristine condition.
Tippecanoe and Tyler too is a phrase that we've heard a lot in history, and it was kind of in some ways the first political slogan used, and it was a song and all these things.
Right.
And it was William Henry Harrison, who, I will say this, kind of a fun fact, if you look up William Henry Harrison's picture, or rather John Tyler's picture, he looks very much like the actor from the old Hammer films that played Dracula. Was on Star Wars all the time. I'm trying to remember what his name was. And Peter Cushing. He very much looks like
Peter, right.
But we're talking about the connection between history and how it kind of cycles back. It's just a fun fact. A couple of weeks ago, when we were planning for this event and I was reading the book, I read in the same day that John Tyler had a grandson who just died.
I saw that. I couldn't
not
believe
great great grandson, not great 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 grandson, an actual grandson.
If that doesn't tell you how relatively recent these events are. I had an experience back in 1992 when I wrote my book on the Battle of Chickamauga in the Civil War, and I was speaking at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And I was speaking about a Union regiment from Ohio that played a critical role in this battle. And when I finished my talk, the host of this conference introduced me to this elderly woman who wanted to thank me for telling the story of her father's service. I said, "Excuse me? Her father's service?" And indeed, she was in her 80s, but her father had been in his late 70s when he married her mother, who was in her early 20s, one of these they called pension brides.
Yeah.
And then, so she was born, I guess, around 1910 or so to this 70+ 80-year-old Civil War veteran. So it was her father that I was speaking of, and that really that floored me.
Yeah, it's funny, like I said, when I read that while I was kind of preparing for this interview, it just really brings it, time compresses when you have moments like that,
It really does.
I'm curious to know, as we wrap up here, how do you know when you want to dive into something? Like you said at the beginning of this, you didn't know too much about Tecumseh and all these things. When does something you're curious about become like, I'm going to spend the next few years and write a book about this? Have you ever kind of started and stopped? Do you ever have dead ends where you think something's going to become something else?
I've had a couple over the years. But I think when it gels, when maybe, two or three things have to happen. First, I have to feel a compelling interest in it. Second, it has to be a story that I think that has not been historical story that has not been adequately told. And three, it has to be of significance. to our history as a nation writ large. Those are my standards today. And but I think, and fourth, I have to believe that it's a story that people will find both not only informative, but also, I hope, entertaining as well. I found
it's a great point actually that you make, because
really neat people as human beings.
Well, it's interesting because, I wonder, what you want to tell us, but the way you have to do it is you have to show us, right? And that's very difficult. Is that something that you think of as a muscle that you flex and it gets stronger as you write more and more books, meaning how to actually use language to describe as opposed to just tell us the facts and figures of the moment?
I think, and I, not to praise myself, but a lot of the praise of my books and of this book, most recent, the words cinematic, narrative, novelistic approach, that kind of praise repeats itself. And I actually, in some ways, consider myself to be a storyteller as much as a historian. I was not trained as a historian, so I'm not bringing an academic perspective, for better or worse. The story I'm trying to tell a good, honest, a true and honest story of what happened in an engaging manner. All my personal reading, to be honest, I love crime noir. I love Russian literature. I love really, really good classic science fiction. I think my wider reading of fiction helps with my narrative voice than if I were just steeped in works of history.
That's so funny. That's so funny that you say that, because that was my last question. Is so many historians and writers of books like this that I've met read predominantly fiction, which is so funny. And I guess it's not surprising, because you don't want to kind of live where you work in a way. And in some ways, the vice versa. I've met so many novelists who are just constantly soaking up works of narrative nonfiction. So I think there's a parallel to that too.
You don't want to end up, if I'm reading history, I don't want to end up taking on another historian's voice inadvertently.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating. The word I would describe the book is propulsive. I thought it was really great pacing. And I will say, everybody, if you guys haven't had a chance to get a copy yet, please look in the chat here. We have links to buy a copy of Tecumseh and the Prophet, or more than one if you'd like to read it more than once. So I think.
And if I could add, Jeff, folks, on my website, if you have any questions after reading the book and want to drop me an email, please feel free to. I will respond.
Yeah, please, definitely. My final question to you is a question I ask everyone who writes books of, works of history or anything that's this kind of in depth. And by the way, that's petercozzens.net. Everybody, we'll put that in the chat. Obviously, you said you did a lot of the research for this. For a lot of your work in the Civil War, there was a lot of letters and a lot of elements like that you were leaning on. I asked this to everyone, so forgive if anybody's heard me ask this question before. I just always am curious. Do you worry about record keeping in the age of email and Twitter, that we won't have the same resources when we're writing about now? And I ask that because, yes, we write stuff all the time, but I don't see that we expose our inner lives as much. How do you feel about that?
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't imagine being someone who's trying to write about maybe 20 years from now or 30 years from now about a contemporary political figure, for instance. I mean, apart from speeches, newspaper articles, TV appearances, Twitter and memoirs of those who wrote them. You're not going to find
it. Public facing. You don't get any of the.
You're going to find the public face. The book I'm working on now, I'm getting to know Andrew Jackson intimately, and that guy, I don't know how he did it. He could be in the field fighting, and he'd still manage to write 4 or 5 letters a day to his wife and to friends, to others, and so you could really get to know these people intimately. And as I'm getting to know Andrew Jackson intimately, I'm seeing a side of him, a side that I like, that I admire and it puts a different face on things that I wouldn't have gotten had I been forced to rely on just the official record. I would not have had a three-dimensional figure.
Yeah, and obviously he's someone who is, for lack of a better word, controversial to this day. Well, I can't thank you enough for writing the book. It really was, like I said, not just informative, but a fun kind of way to escape into a period that I didn't know anything about. So I look forward to the next book. And I just want to say on behalf of everybody, thanks for doing that. And I hope you have a great rest of your virtual tour. And we hope to have you back in some way, in person or virtual, somewhere down the road.
Well, next book should be 3 years down the road. So I would hope by then.
We'll be good. Well, thank you so much, Peter. Have a great one.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.